What would you do if your family laughed while handing you a warped, mold-spotted wooden case as your only inheritance, and then called to make sure you knew the joke was intentional? Stay with this, because what happened to Stella Hargrove inside a Philadelphia art gallery on a grey November afternoon will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about what's worth keeping. The morning of the will reading, Stella Hargrove, 31, ironed the same black dress she had worn to her grandfather's funeral 11 years earlier. It still fit, barely. She had lost weight over the past 4 years, not from dieting, but from the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from sleeping light, always listening for sounds from the other room. The law offices of Oliver Hatch were on the 14th floor of a building on Broad Street in Philadelphia, with floor-to-ceiling windows that faced west and a view of the city that looked more impressive in the morning, before the afternoon haze set in. The carpet was the color of old money. The chairs were leather and stiff. Stella sat near the window. Across the polished conference table sat her brother Douglas Hargrove, 44, already checking his phone before anyone had said a single word. His wife Pamela sat beside him, one manicured hand resting on the table, the other wrapped around a coffee she had brought from outside because she found the office's coffee unacceptable. Their cousin Chester lounged near the door, arms crossed, wearing the kind of studied indifference that only people who expected to receive something substantial could afford. None of them had visited Mildred Hargrove in the last 2 years of her life. Not once. Douglas had mentioned a business cycle. Pamela had a standing yoga class on Tuesday mornings and a delicate immune system that made hospital environments difficult. Chester lived in Austin, which everyone seemed to accept as explanation enough. Stella had moved in. She had been 27 when Mildred's first fall happened. She had been in the middle of her 3rd year teaching 4th grade at a public school in Germantown, and she had been good at it. The kind of teacher parents requested by name. She gave it up without agonizing over the decision for long. There was nobody else. She sublet her apartment in Fishtown, packed 3 boxes, and moved into the drafty row house in Chestnut Hill, where Mildred had lived for 52 years. The next 4 years were not dramatic in any cinematic way. They were small and exhausting and relentless. There were pill organizers sorted every Sunday night. There were doctor's appointments where Stella sat in hard plastic chairs and took notes because Mildred could no longer track what the doctors were saying. There were nights when Mildred woke at 2 a.m. convinced she was somewhere she had been in 1965, and Stella would sit with her at the kitchen table and make decaf and talk her gently back to the present. She did not do any of it for money. She did it because Mildred was the only person in her life who had ever looked at her with the specific kind of attention that made her feel like she mattered. Oliver Hatch cleared his throat and began. Douglas received the house in Chestnut Hill, a 4-bedroom with original hardwood floors and a market value just under $800,000. He also received Mildred's primary investment portfolio and the remaining balance of her savings account. Pamela received the jewelry collection, including a set of pearl earrings that had belonged to Mildred's mother and a sapphire brooch that Stella had watched Mildred wear to every Christmas dinner she could remember. Chester received a trust fund that would disperse over 5 years. Oliver paused, shuffled 1 page and read, "To my granddaughter Stella, in recognition of her presence and her patience, I leave the contents of the storage room in the basement, specifically the old flat case that has been kept against the east wall, and everything inside it." There was a beat of silence. Then Douglas made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like a single exhale of amusement pushed through his nose. "The basement." He looked at Pamela. "She's getting the basement." Pamela pressed her lips together. "Oh, Stella, well, Mildred always did have a sense of humor." Chester said nothing, but he was smiling at his phone. Oliver rose from behind his desk and returned carrying an object that he set on the conference table with both hands, as if he didn't want to touch it for long. It was a flat wooden case, approximately the size and shape of an artist's portfolio, maybe 20 inches wide, 4 inches deep. It had a leather handle that was cracked and partially detached. The wood was water-warped along the bottom edge, swollen and split in one corner. The surface was mottled with mold spots that had been there so long they had faded to grey, and smeared across the top and one side were old paint stains in a half-dozen colours. Cadmium yellow, cobalt blue, a streak of burnt sienna, dried and cracked and ground into the grain of the wood. The latch was broken. Someone had secured it with a length of twine tied in a rough bough. It looked like something a sanitation crew would photograph before throwing it away. "The key?" Stella asked quietly. "There's no key," Oliver said. "It's not locked, just tied." "She's really going all out," Douglas said, buttoning his jacket and standing. "Listen, are we done here? I have a 3 o'clock. "Almost," Oliver said. "I almost feel bad." Pamela reached over and patted Stella's hand with 2 fingers. "The way you might touch something you weren't sure was clean. Almost." Stella did not look at either of them. She reached forward and lifted the case by the handle. The cracked leather bit into her palm. The case was heavier than it looked, genuinely, surprisingly heavy, the kind of weight that shifts your balance. She carried it out of the building on Broad Street, through the lobby, onto the sidewalk, and onto the southbound bus. She held it on her lap for the entire ride. The man sitting next to her moved his leg away from hers without looking at her. A faint smell, linseed oil and something mineral, rose from the warped wood every time she shifted her grip. Her apartment in Fishtown was a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a narrow building wedged between a Vietnamese restaurant and a laundromat. She had barely used it in 4 years and it smelled like it. She set the case on the kitchen table and sat down across from it and did not open it immediately. Her phone buzzed. Douglas. She answered because she couldn't help it. "Made it back to your place all right?" His voice was even, almost pleasant, the voice of someone who felt very secure about the outcome of the day. "What do you want, Douglas?" "Just checking in." A pause. "I'm going to be straight with you, Stella. I feel a little guilty, not about the will. Grandma knew what she was doing, but about the case specifically." "Why?" "Because I'm the one who suggested it." She went very still. "I was up at the house about 6 weeks before she passed," he said. "She asked me what she should leave you. She was having a good day, mentally speaking. I told her you were too practical to care about money, that you'd probably prefer something with sentimental value." Another pause, and she could hear him enjoying it. "I reminded her about that junk case in the basement." She laughed. She actually laughed, Stella. "We thought it was the perfect metaphor, something heavy and worthless that you'd been dragging around your whole life." His voice shifted to something that might have been, in a different person, almost kind. "Don't bother trying to sell whatever's inside. Grandma kept old rags and dried-up paint tubes in that thing. It's trash. Throw it out and move on." The call ended. Stella sat at the table for a long time after that. The anger came slowly, like something compressed for years finding a crack to seep through. She stared at the case. Douglas was almost certainly right about the contents. She could remember Mildred's basement from childhood. Shelves of things being saved for no clear reason. Cardboard boxes with handwritten labels she couldn't read. The smell of a space that had accumulated decades without being edited. An old art case from the basement probably did contain exactly what he said. But the case was genuinely, inexplicably heavy. And there was something else. She tilted it toward the light from the kitchen window. Near the top left corner, almost obscured by a smear of dried cobalt blue, were 2 initials painted in small, deliberate brush strokes. Not accidental, not a splash or a drip, but intentional. Precise. E.H. Those were not Mildred's initials. Mildred's maiden name had been Calloway, her married name Hargrove, M.H. Stella untied the twine and opened the case. Inside, wrapped individually in oilcloth that had been folded and secured with rubber bands so old they had dried and crumbled, were what appeared to be 7 rectangular paintings on wooden board. Beneath them, tucked flat against the bottom of the case, was a small leather-bound notebook, soft with age, its cover worn pale along the spine. And wedged in the corner between the notebook and the inner wall of the case was a sealed envelope with Stella's name written on it in Mildred's handwriting, the careful, slightly trembling script of her last year. Stella did not open the envelope. She wrapped the case back up, put on her coat, and walked to the bus stop. On Walnut Street in Center City, between a restaurant she couldn't afford and a boutique that sold candles for $40, was a narrow storefront with a dark green awning. Drummond Gallery and fine art appraisals. She had walked past it 100 times without going in. It was the kind of place that made you feel underdressed, just looking through the window. The bell above the door was quiet and precise. The air inside was cool and carried the faint smell of linseed oil and climate control. The walls held paintings in frames under soft directional lighting. Glass cases displayed drawings, small bronzes, signed prints. Elliot Drummond, 58, looked up from behind the front counter. He was a tall man with grey at his temples and the posture of someone who had spent decades telling other people their things were worth less than they thought. He wore a linen shirt. His reading glasses were folded beside a loop on the counter. He took one look at Stella, the second-hand coat, the worn shoes, the warped wooden case under her arm, and his expression settled into the professional courtesy of someone about to redirect a stranger to a pawn shop. "Can I help you?" He said it the way people say it when they mean the opposite. "I have something I need looked at." She set the case on the glass counter. The warped wood scraped against the surface, and Elliot flinched almost imperceptibly. "I know how it looks. I just need 5 minutes." "We don't appraise estate sale." 5 minutes, she said. "Please. My family gave me this as a joke. I just need to know if there's anything real inside it before I throw it away." Something about the flatness of her voice made him pause. He looked at her for a moment, then at the case. 5 minutes, he said. She unfolded the oilcloth on the nearest wrapped board and slid it out. Even before it was fully unwrapped, the smell rose. Oil paint, old and rich and layered, and Elliot's posture shifted almost invisibly. By the time the first painting was fully exposed, he had already reached for the loop without thinking. It was a small oil on wood board about 12 inches by 9. It showed a gas station at dusk. A single pump, a car at a diagonal, the last flat light of day catching the edge of a canopy and the windshield in a way that made the whole thing feel like a held breath. The paint was built up in thin, precise layers. The color was extraordinary, not bright but exact. The kind of color that came from someone who understood exactly what they were trying to say. Elliot placed the loop against his right eye and leaned in. He stopped moving. Stella watched the change happen. It was subtle but total, like watching a foundation shift beneath a structure. His free hand, which had been resting casually on the counter edge, pressed flat against the glass. His breathing changed. Not faster, it stopped entirely. In the lower right corner of the painting, painted small but unmistakably clear, were 2 initials and a year, EH, 1948. Elliot set the loop down on the counter very carefully. He didn't look at Stella. He was looking at the painting with the expression of a man trying to determine whether he was awake. He said so quietly she almost didn't catch it, "Can you excuse me for just 1 moment?" He walked to the front door and turned the deadbolt. He flipped the sign to closed. He came back behind the counter and stood for a moment with both hands braced on the glass, and then he lifted his face and she saw that his eyes were wet, not leaking yet, but filled, the way eyes fill before someone decides whether to let it happen. He made that decision by turning slightly to the side and pressing 2 fingers against his mouth. When he turned back, the professional composure was completely gone. In its place was something that looked a lot like awe, and something else underneath it, the stunned, undone look of a man who had spent a career searching for something and had stopped believing he would find it. "Miss Hargrove," he said, his voice rough, stripped of every trace of the disdain he'd walked in with. "Where did you get this?" "My grandmother's basement." He stared at her. "Your grandmother?" "Mildred Hargrove. She lived in Chestnut Hill. She grew up in West Philadelphia." Elliot turned away, reached under the counter, and brought out a large, flat reference book. Cloth spine, no title on the cover, the kind of book that exists in only a few rooms in the world. He opened it to a page near the middle. There was a black and white photograph of a painting, a roadside diner, early morning, a quality of light that felt like standing outside the moment rather than inside it. In the corner of the photograph, barely visible, E.H. "Everett Holt," Elliot said. He pressed one hand flat on the page as if steadying himself. "Active from roughly 1935 to 1951. American realist, some called him a regionalist, but that was never right. He was doing something more precise than that, something about stillness in ordinary American spaces that no one else has ever quite replicated. He showed in New York 3 times in the 40s, and then in 1951 he simply stopped. No announcement, no explanation. He left almost no paper trail. A handful of pieces are in private collections. 3 are in museum collections. The rest, everyone assumed lost. Auction houses have had standing offers since the 1980s for any information on his remaining work." He looked at her. "There are 7 paintings in that case." Stella put one hand on the edge of the counter. Her knees had become uncertain. "Your grandmother," Elliot said slowly, trying to work it out, "was her grandfather, by any chance, in a trade? Construction, maybe, or renovation work?" "He had a lumber business. He did renovation work in West Philadelphia through the 40s. Elliot pressed both hands over his face briefly and then lowered them. "Holt lived in West Philadelphia from 1945 to 1951. He rented a studio in a row house on Locust Street. There are letters archived at the Smithsonian, where he mentions a neighbor who did work on the building. He says he settled a debt to the man with paintings. The letters never specify which paintings or how many. He looked at the 7 canvases laid out on his counter, until now. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of an antique clock somewhere on the far wall. "I need an independent conservator," Elliot said, and his voice had the controlled steadiness of someone forcing themselves to be methodical when every instinct was pulling the other direction. 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. But I can tell you right now, Miss Hargrove, the style, the board composition, the initials, the date, the provenance chain from Holt's own archived letters. I have been in this business for 31 years. He looked at her directly. I have never held my breath like this. If these are authenticated, you are looking at the most significant private discovery of American realist painting in at least 40 years. The auction estimate for even the smallest of these would start in the mid-7 figures. Stella did not say anything for a long moment. She looked at the 7 paintings laid out under the gallery lights, pulled from a mold-spotted case that her brother had suggested as a joke, from a basement that had been the punchline, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. She remembered the envelope. She opened it there at the counter, while Elliot carefully rewrapped each painting in fresh archival cloth. The paper was heavy, cream-colored stationery, no letterhead, just Mildred's handwriting. Careful, slightly trembling, deliberate. "My dear Stella, if you're reading this, you did exactly what I knew you would do. You didn't throw away something heavy just because it looked worthless. You carried it, the same way you carried me for 4 years without complaining, without keeping score, without ever once making me feel like a burden. Your great-grandfather did renovation work for a young artist in 1947 and 1948. The man had no money. He paid your great-grandfather in the only thing he had. I've kept that case in the basement since your grandfather died because I didn't want to make a fuss. I should have told someone sooner. I didn't. I'm sorry for that. I let Douglas believe he thought of something clever. I let him suggest the case. It was the only way to make sure it went to the right person without a fight. Your brother only looks at surfaces. He always has. He saw a rusted hinge and a warped lid and thought he'd found the perfect insult. He didn't look at the weight. You did. I love you more than I ever knew how to say out loud. You are the only one who ever looked at me and saw a person instead of an inconvenience. Live well, my darling. You have earned every single bright thing coming to you. All my love, Grandma. Stella folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. She stood with her hand pressed flat against the worn fabric, over the pocket, over the letter, and she breathed. The authentication took 11 days. On the 12th, Elliot called at 7:40 in the morning. By that evening, the story had reached Douglas the way these things always do. A mutual contact, a phone call, the wrong word in the wrong ear. He appeared at the hotel suite Stella had moved into, with 2 lawyers in dark suits, and Pamela standing slightly behind him, her arms wrapped around herself. You manipulated a sick woman, Douglas said, before he was fully through the door. 4 years living in that house, and you worked on her. I was in the room when Oliver Hatch read the will, Stella said. She was standing by the window. She had bought a new blazer that morning because she could. You laughed. You told me to throw it in the river. Would you like to revisit that advice? The paintings belong to the estate, one of Douglas's lawyers said, stepping forward. They were stored in a property that passed to my client under the will. The contents. The will specifically enumerated the case and its contents as a separate bequest, said Catherine Mercer, stepping out of the adjoining room. Former assistant U.S. attorney, now senior partner at one of the most respected litigation practices in Philadelphia. She had returned Stella's call within 4 hours. She handed each of Douglas's lawyers a bound folder. You're welcome to contest the specificity of the bequest. You'll spend 3 years and $150,000 in legal fees doing it. You will lose. Douglas was already looking at the folder. He had gone the particular pale of someone whose blood pressure has just dropped. Page 12, Catherine said pleasantly. The house in Chestnut Hill. It's been subject to deferred property taxes for 6 years. A hardship deferral that terminates upon change of ownership. Page 13 is the balance due. Page 16 covers the lead remediation order the city issued last fall on the lower level. Page 20 is the outstanding second mortgage, not serviced since 2019. She let him keep looking. The investment portfolio, she continued, was restructured 18 months ago. The current positions are on page 31. They are, for the most part, in places your grandmother appears to have anticipated you would not examine closely before signing the inheritance paperwork. Douglas set the folder down on the side table. His hands were not entirely steady. Pamela had sat down without being invited to. She was looking at her hands, at the diamond ring she was turning slowly on her finger, as if she were seeing it for the first time and trying to calculate what it would bring. She knew, Douglas said. Not angry now, something closer to bewildered and hollow. She planned all of it. She was a very intelligent woman, Stella said. She just didn't always let people see what she understood. Douglas did not argue about the injunction. His lawyers were already moving toward the door, quietly recalculating what a client with no liquid assets and a remediation order could actually pay them. He stood near the window for a moment, looking out at the city, and then he left without saying anything else. Pamela followed. Chester, who had never been invited and had shown up anyway, left first. The door closed. The quiet that came after it had a weight of its own, the particular weight of something that had been carrying you for a long time, finally being set down. The auction took place the following spring. All 7 paintings by Everett Holt were authenticated and consigned to a major house in New York. The smallest sold for $2.1 million. The largest, the gas station at dusk, the one that had made Elliot stop breathing, sold for $11.4 million. The leather-bound notebook, Holt's personal diary from his West Philadelphia years, was purchased by a university library for its archive. The total came to just under $31 million. Stella was not in the auction room when the gavel came down. She watched the live stream from a rented house in Cape May, sitting cross-legged on a bed with a mug of coffee, the letter from Mildred folded and kept in the drawer of the nightstand beside her. She watched the numbers climb on the screen, and she felt something she had not let herself feel in a very long time. Something simple and almost physical, like a window opening in a room that had been closed too long. She went back to teaching the following fall, not because she needed to, because she wanted to. She took a position at a school in West Philadelphia, the same neighborhood where Everett Holt had rented his studio, where her great-grandfather had done renovation work, where a debt had been paid in oil paintings that spent 60 years in a damp basement, waiting for someone who wouldn't throw them away. Here's what I want you to sit with. If you had been standing in that law office, holding a warped, mold-spotted case, while your family laughed, would you have taken it home? Or would you have left it on the conference table and walked out with your dignity? Because Stella almost left it. Her arms were already shaking from the weight before she reached the elevator. She kept going anyway. Sometimes the thing worth keeping is the one nobody else wanted to carry. If this story made you think about the weight you've been holding, the things people told you weren't worth it, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to keep the drama so you don't miss what's coming next. And drop a comment below. What would you have done with that case?